Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for a really unflinching look at power, at pride, and, well, the ultimate surrender to biology.
We are.
We're diving into the final horrific chapter of a figure who completely defined the trajectory of the English-speaking world, William the Conqueror.
And when we talk about William, we're talking about the impossible. He crosses the Channel, wins the Battle of Hastings in 1066.
A huge deal.
An unbelievable undertaking. Then he consolidates control over an entire island, commissions the Domesday Book. One of the earliest, most comprehensive administrative records in history. The man was the epitome of iron will, military brilliance, and just absolute brutal power.
And when you look at all those achievements, you just see a man who believed himself to be, well, unconquerable. But the history we're really focusing on today is the catastrophic failure of his final weeks.
Right.
We're talking about the late summer of 1087.
Right.
This dive isn't about the conquest of England. It's about the impossible horror of his own body conquering him.
It's the ultimate paradox, isn't it? Here's a man who wielded total control over his world, and he's reduced to nothing. Just vulnerable, decaying flesh. He was, by all accounts, rotting alive in a monastery.
Abandoned, robbed.
Utterly abandoned, robbed, and ultimately subjected to one of the most undignified, just frankly disgusting ends recorded for any major historical ruler.
So our mission today, using the incredible accounts left by medieval chroniclers, people like Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury, and then applying the cold, hard logic of modern forensic medicine, is to explain exactly what happened. We want to understand how a king was transformed into a biological catastrophe, why the suffering was so grotesque, and what that says about the fleeting nature of human ambition, even for you, our listener, today.
It's a profound lesson. It just strips away all the gold and the crowns. It reveals that no amount of power, no amount of wealth can bargain with intestinal flora or bacterial decay. So let's unpack this historical and biological disaster.
We really have to start with the incident that detonated this entire catastrophe. It didn't begin with a battle or a siege. It began, ironically enough, with an insult.
Yes, an insult that targeted William's greatest source of pride, his physical dominance.
So what was the context here? He's an older man at this point?
He is. William was approaching 60, which is a remarkable age for the 11th century. But the physical reality of his opulent life had caught up with him. He was, by all accounts, massively corpulent.
And his rival, King Philip I of France, who had suffered numerous humiliations at William's hands, he saw his chance. He saw a way to strike a wound that was purely psychological.
Exactly. Philip compared the aging, slow, and exceedingly large William to, and chroniclers record this with a certain amount of malice, a pregnant woman.
Wow.
William was reportedly confined to his bed in Rouen, swollen, heavy, unable to move quickly, and Philip joked that he was just waiting for the delivery, and that it would be an extremely expensive churching ceremony.
That is just a devastatingly precise insult for a man like William.
Oh, it's a devastating, targeted strike. William had constructed his entire legacy on being this formidable, active, masculine warrior who dominated through physical presence.
Right. The man on the horse, the conqueror.
To be equated with a pregnant woman, a symbol of corpulence, slowness, physical weakness, it was an unforgivable emasculation. It suggested his control was gone, his vigor was spent, and his authority was fading right along with his waistband.
And I think we need to contextualize just how much his body had changed. He wasn't just a bit overweight. The sources suggest a relentless expansion over decades.
Absolutely. He was a man accustomed to conquering lands and feasts in equal measure. The medieval king's diet was essentially a death sentence waiting to happen.
What are we talking about? Rich, heavy meats.
Rich meats, bread soaked in fat, and oceans. Literally oceans of high-alcohol wine and ale. This consumption lifestyle, coupled with reduced physical activity as his court became more, solidified, led to severe, probably morbid obesity.
So his body size was a direct indicator of his status and wealth.
It was, but it was also a ticking clock.
So when Philip's insult reaches him, it doesn't just annoy him, it wounds his core identity.
Deeply. He had built his authority on being physically formidable, and now he was being ridiculed for being fat and soft.
And wounded pride, especially in a man who is accustomed to absolute obedience, that often manifests as just disproportionate rage.
And it did. He couldn't let the insult stand. Strategic thinking just went right out the window. This was personal now. He had to prove immediately and violently that he was still the destroyer.
Still physically capable.
Still lethal.
So that rage just propels him into action. In the summer of 1087, he gathers his forces, gets out of his sickbed, and moves toward Mantes, a small French town.
Yeah, and this was not about reclaiming territory. This was about answering mockery with maximum devastation.
The intention was to wipe Mantes off the map, to show Philip that the pregnant woman could still give birth to devastation.
And the Normans put the town to the torch with extreme prejudice. This was coordinated, total destruction. The sources are harrowing. They describe screams of trapped civilians as the entire town just became an inferno.
And William is right there, in the middle of it. He's riding through the burning streets on his warhorse, his destrier, amidst the chaos and the smoke.
He's asserting his dominance over the flames, over the terror. It must have felt like a moment of absolute, unchallenged power, the perfect answer to the mockery.
But history, it so often pivots on a single, almost mundane mistake.
It does, and while he was riding through that disruption, maybe surveying the damage or just savoring the moment, the sources say his horse suddenly reared violently.
Why? What would have startled it?
It could have been anything. A collapsing building, the heat from the embers on the ground, just the general commotion and screaming. A warhorse is trained, but it's still an animal.
And because of his massive, heavy frame, which was already unbalanced on the horse, he was thrown forward with immense force.
The physics of that moment were catastrophic. He wasn't thrown clear of the horse. He was smashed directly against the iron pommel of his saddle.
Can you describe what a pommel is for people who might not know?
Sure. It's the hard, often metal horn that projects up from the front of the saddle. It's designed to secure the rider, to give them a brace. But for William, carrying that immense weight and girth, that metal horn acted like a perfectly placed, unmoving weapon.
It drove deep into his swollen abdomen.
It did.
So what precisely would that kind of impact have done internally to a man of his size? We're not talking about a bruise here. We're talking about a massive internal pressure wave focused on a single point.
Exactly. Given his extreme obesity, the outer layer of fat would have absorbed some of the initial impact, but the vital organs underneath, especially the gut, the intestines, maybe the mesentery which holds them, or even the spleen, they would have been violently compressed against the rigid column of his spine.
So there's nowhere for them to go.
Nowhere. The most likely outcome, and the one that fits every single detail the chroniclers describe, the immediate searing pain and the subsequent swelling, is a full-thickness rupture of the small or large intestine.
So the single object that helped keep the warrior seated on his horse,
The iron pommel.
became the instrument of his death.
It's a brutal irony. A simple physical accident, caused by his body's own excess and amplified by his wounded pride, sealed the fate of the man who conquered England.
The conqueror was brought down not by a political rival or an army,
but by a catastrophic, unrepairable biological failure. The war was over, and the enemy was now internal.
From that moment of impact, William's suffering was just relentless. He was carried back to Rouen, which was miles away, in a litter. You have to imagine the excruciating pain with every jolt of that cart.
The sources depict a man who had gone from the absolute peak of command to a screaming, broken figure. He was placed in the Priory of St. Gervais, seeking the only comfort available to him at that time: quiet and prayer.
But within days, the biological catastrophe began its visible, unstoppable progression.
It did. His abdomen began to swell visibly and rapidly. This was a clear sign that fluids and waste products were accumulating inside his body cavity. It confirms that the barrier between the digestive system and the sterile abdomen was gone.
Let's pause on the medical reality here, because this is really where modern science unlocks the terror that the chroniclers were trying to describe. The rupture had occurred. What happens next biologically?
So the crucial step is the introduction of the body's own, usually beneficial, bacteria, specifically the normal flora found in the gut, organisms like E. coli, into the sterile environment of the peritoneal cavity.
And that's a place they should never, ever be.
Never. This immediately sparks an overwhelming, virulent infection. We call it peritonitis. The body's immune system goes into absolute overdrive, leading to fever, massive inflammation, and huge internal fluid accumulation, which is known as ascites.
So while this massive internal war is raging, what were the most skilled physicians of 1087 attempting to do? They couldn't diagnose an internal breach like this.
They were completely powerless. They were operating entirely within the framework of the Galenic and Hippocratic four humors theory.
Right.
They didn't see a bacterial infection. They saw an imbalance of humors. probably too much yellow bile or blood, creating heat and corruption in the body. So their response was not just futile, it's probably detrimental.
They bled him, didn't they, trying to draw out the excess or bad blood?
Exactly. They performed bloodletting, draining liters of vital fluid from a man who was already weakened by shock and systemic infection. They applied poultices made of herbs and, well, probably questionable substances, praying for some kind of efficacy.
They were fighting a modern army with sticks and stones.
That's a perfect analogy. They were completely unprepared for the microscopic nature of the enemy. Their reliance on prayer and deeply flawed theory meant they were really just spectators to William's death.
And this is where the horror truly escalates, moving beyond just a fatal infection. The chroniclers describe not just the swelling, but an active, visible decay setting in while he was still alive. This suggests something beyond routine peritonitis.
It does. That points directly to the development of a secondary anaerobic infection, specifically gas gangrene, caused by bacteria like Clostridium perfringens.
And what do these bacteria do?
These bacteria thrive in low-oxygen dying tissue. That's precisely the environment created by a massive abdominal trauma and infection. There's no fresh blood getting to those tissues.
That's the perfect breeding ground.
Oh, perfect breeding ground. And what Clostridium perfringens does that is so devastating is that it actively consumes this dying tissue, and as a metabolic byproduct, it releases vast quantities of gases, primarily hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide.
And this gas has nowhere to go.
Nowhere to go. It accumulates rapidly beneath the skin and within the abdominal cavity, transforming the body into, for lack of a better term, a biological balloon. This is why the chroniclers were so specific. They described his abdomen swelling to an enormous size and becoming taut like a drum about to split.
So the visual transformation was horrifying. The swelling was immense, but the sources also mention discoloration. They say red turning to purple, then spreading patches of black.
That discoloration is a classic sign of wet gangrene. The tissue is actively dying, that's necrosis, due to the lack of blood supply and the massive bacterial load. The black patches are classic signs of tissue decomposition. The skin, stretched thin and poisoned by toxins and gas, begins to show the internal process of decay.
He was literally decomposing from the inside out.
While his consciousness remained intact.
You have to imagine the psychological terror of that. He could feel this internal destruction, see the physical evidence of his body transforming into a rotting mass, and hear his own constant screams of agony, which the sources say echoed through the entire priory.
It's somatic betrayal at its worst. This infection was a physical manifestation of his final, ultimate loss of control. Here is a man who controlled borders, armies, and people. But here, his own cells were staging a revolt he could not suppress.
And the chroniclers heard his screams because the pain of this rapid decay and gas buildup was just constant.
Relentless. Unimaginable.
And then there is the inescapable element, the stench. The sources dedicate paragraph after paragraph to the overwhelming odor. You mentioned it was a sensory violation.
It was more than that. It was a physiological assault. Decomposition produces specific volatile organic compounds. In this case, primarily things we now call putrescine and cadaverine.
The names say it all.
They really do. These compounds are the very signature of rotting flesh, and they were emanating from William's body in such volume that it became a physical barrier.
How bad must the smell be to make hardened guards and religious men flee their posts?
Bad enough to induce an overwhelming reflexive response. The gag reflex, immediate vomiting, the smell permeated everything. It wasn't just in the room. It clung to the fabric of their clothes, their hair.
So any attempts to mask it were useless.
Completely futile. Servants who entered had to wrap cloths soaked in rosewater and vinegar around their faces, but these perfumes were instantly eclipsed by the overwhelming, concentrated stench of internal death. The smell became the ultimate, non-negotiable test of loyalty.
And that loyalty failed. The man who commanded respect through fear could no longer command proximity through sheer biological reality.
The stench of decay proved more powerful than the fear of the king.
It acted as a kind of biological quarantine.
Exactly. Attendants fled the chamber, then they fled the priory, unable to bear the active, living decomposition emanating from a still-breathing man. And this marks the transition from physical horror to a complete social collapse.
The moment William's body began to fail, his vast, meticulously constructed political and personal power structure just dissolved.
It's incredible how fast it happened. The decline of his physical health triggered a simultaneous social breakdown, which is, in its own way, as shocking as the biological horror.
It highlights the transactional nature of medieval loyalty, doesn't it?
It really does. Loyalty was often secured by immediate fear, or by reward, or by the expectation of future reward. When the king is clearly dying and dying horribly, both fear and expectation just vanish at the same time.
And the most immediate, brazen sign of this collapse was the theft.
Yeah.
While he was still conscious, suffering immensely, people were actively stealing from him.
It's astonishing. Servants, guards, even petty nobles who approached the chamber, those few who could brave the stench, began pilfering his personal effects. Gold chains, cups, jeweled daggers, fine robes. They just vanished. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis noted the sheer audacity of it.
Vitalis captures this moment of profound indignity. He wrote that men who had once prostrated themselves before William were now stepping over his rotting body to reach his treasures.
Think about that phrasing.
They were treating the great king not as a sovereign, but as a negligible obstacle to immediate enrichment.
The irony is just brutal. William had spent his entire life conquering wealth and territory, establishing legal supremacy. Yet in his final days, his own immediate staff were committing petty theft right in front of him. This wasn't just looting, it was a total rejection of his authority. It was a sign that the law he enforced was dead the moment his body began to rot.
But was there no fear of reprisal? I mean, even a dying king could theoretically order punishments.
Right. That's the key psychological shift. They knew he was too far gone to follow through. The illness provided impunity. The theft was the clearest possible evidence that his power existed only as long as his body sustained it.
The moment the body became unreliable.
The loyalty based on fear evaporated. Some sources even suggest the attendants exchanged jokes and laughed as they divided the spoils, which just highlights the complete contempt that replaced the fear.
And yet, despite this massive public and personal humiliation, William remained profoundly devout. He tried to make a kind of spiritual accounting.
He knew he was facing imminent divine judgment.
Yes, the conqueror had to face the ultimate audit. He confessed his sins to the attending priests, acknowledging the terrible cost of his ambition in human lives. But one specific sin stood out and demanded public confession.
The harrying of the North in 1069.
We absolutely must elaborate on this because it underscores the magnitude of the brutality William was confessing to. The harrying wasn't just a punitive raid.
Oh, it was far, far beyond that. The harrying of the North was a deliberate, systematic, scorched earth campaign designed to suppress a rebellion in Yorkshire and the surrounding areas.
How systematic are we talking?
William's Norman troops spent months destroying every source of food and shelter. They burned crops in the fields, they poisoned water supplies with salt and animal carcasses, and they slaughtered virtually all livestock.
The historical records confirm that the intent was to create an uninhabitable zone. It was a calculated act of terror designed to ensure that the populace would starve or freeze, removing any possibility of future organized resistance.
The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest that the famine and cold that followed the destruction led to the deaths of as many as 100,000 people.
100,000.
It was an act of state-sponsored ethnic cleansing by starvation. People resorted to cannibalism in some areas just to survive the winter. This was the massive moral debt William knew he carried.
So William, lying in that chamber, facing a physical decomposition that seemed almost tailored to his sins, he confesses this specific, systematic cruelty.
He sought desperately that final absolution. He ordered money to be distributed to the poor and for the rebuilding of churches he had destroyed in Mentis. But even this act of spiritual redemption was undermined by the physical reality of his condition.
Because the priests, who were the conduits of divine mercy, could barely stand to be in the room with him.
The sources are visceral on this point. The priests were forced to rush through the sacred rites. They stumbled through the final prayers and the act of absolution, constantly turning toward the open doorway, gasping for fresh air.
Their hands twitching in their haste to finish and just retreat.
Yes. The stench was a physical and a spiritual contamination. It suggests that even the spiritual framework of the age, the belief in God's mercy, was challenged by the empirical reality of the king's rotting body.
It was a tangible sign that the wages of sin, as medieval society saw it, were being paid in the most horrifying way possible.
Right. And then finally, he died.
William finally died on September 9th, 1087, and the abandonment was immediate and total. The few remaining servants, who had lingered only for the moment of death, promptly fled the priory.
They left the massive, rapidly decomposing corpse right where it lay.
This created an unprecedented logistical crisis. Here was the King of England, a man whose funeral should have been meticulously planned for months, and yet his body was left unattended on the floor. His passing was marked not by solemnity, but by panic.
And the problem was immediate. How do you honor a king when his corpse is already a biological liability? The body was too heavy, too bloated, and too far advanced in decay for standard royal embalming.
So the professional embalmers, when they were summoned, they took one look.
And immediately refused the task. You simply cannot work with a body that is actively dissolving. The flesh was described as soft and yielding, the internal pressure already distorting its shape.
It fell to a single local knight named Helene, who, perhaps for a substantial fee, agreed to organize the arrangements. The preparation itself sounds like something out of a horror film.
It was a macabre exercise in damage limitation. The body was roughly washed, a process where the decaying flesh was reportedly so soft it just peeled away at the slightest touch, and then it was wrapped in cloth that was heavily soaked in wine and spices.
Hoping the alcohol and aromatics would temporarily mask the odor.
A desperate hope. They then placed him in a massive, custom-made, lead-lined coffin.
The lead lining was the crucial step, wasn't it? It was the desperate attempt to create a sealed biological container.
Exactly, hoping to trap the gases and the smell for the journey to Caen, where he was to be buried in Saint-Étienne Abbey. They knew the decomposition was accelerating, and the lead was intended to contain the disaster.
The journey became a frantic, desperate race. They had to move the body quickly before the container itself failed.
But the container was not sufficient. As the solemn procession, if you can even call it that, moved through the countryside, the smell leaked out immediately, defeating the lead and the spices.
The sources paint a picture of public revulsion.
They do. Peasants and citizens who gathered to witness the procession out of respect, or maybe just curiosity, were forced to gag and flee, stumbling back from the road. The odor was so intense that even animals reacted. Dogs were observed howling and running away.
Their acute sense of smell, detecting something profoundly foul and dangerous.
And then, fate introduced a critical destructive delay. When they finally reached Caen, a massive fire broke out in the town.
Oh, no.
It caused chaos and forced the burial to be delayed for crucial hours.
And in the height of summer, those hours were catastrophic.
Think of the physics involved. Inside that sealed, lead-lined box, the anaerobic bacteria, the gas gangrene, are just continuing their feast, producing those gases nonstop. The summer heat is amplifying their metabolic rate.
So the sealed coffin became a pressure cooker. You called it a bomb of putrefaction.
That's essentially what it was, a biological time bomb with pressure accumulating steadily inside the confines of the lead lining. Every passing hour guaranteed a more violent, more dramatic release when that container was finally breached.
So by the time the fire was controlled and they could proceed to Saint-Étienne Abbey, the body was swollen to an unbelievable degree. The internal pressure was maximized.
And inside the Abbey church, the scene was set for the final disgrace. Nobles, bishops, and clergy, compelled by duty, crowded the space. They were expecting a state ceremony, trying to ignore the rumors, trying to maintain some dignity.
And waiting before the altar was the final piece of the tragic puzzle. The heavy stone sarcophagus.
Yes, and it had been carved years earlier. It was sized for William when he was perhaps robust, but nowhere near the morbidly obese, gas-bloated mass he had become. The measurements were just wrong.
It guaranteed a geometric impossibility.
But the tragedy was locked in. The man whose life was defined by iron control was now subject to the immutable laws of fluid dynamics and gas pressure, all thanks to a missized coffin.
So as the pallbearers carried that massive, lead-lined coffin down the central aisle of Saint-Étienne, the crisis began immediately. The lingering, leaking odor was enough to compromise the entire ceremony.
It was a sensory assault that just broke human decorum. People coughed, they retreated, they pressed handkerchiefs to their faces. The sense of dread in that church must have been palpable.
The clergy, desperate to rush the proceedings, raced through the prayers.
They were keen to just bury the evidence of the king's decay as quickly as possible.
And then came the moment of absolute, total horror, the climax of William's life and death. The coffin had to be opened beside the sarcophagus for the transfer.
And that single moment released the concentrated gases and stench that had been building up within the lead lining for days. The odor was no longer an unpleasant smell. It was an overwhelming toxic cloud of putrescine and cadaverine vapor, concentrated and pressurized.
The effect was instant and catastrophic.
People began to openly vomit, contaminating the sacred space. Bishops and powerful nobles, men of iron constitutions who had witnessed countless battlefields, fled for the doors, their composure completely shattered.
The sound of retching and running replaced the solemn prayers.
It was the moment of complete social disgrace. The pallbearers, caught between the horror and the desperate need to complete their duty, attempted the impossible, forcing the grotesquely bloated corpse into the undersized stone sarcophagus.
And the sources confirmed the inevitable outcome. The body simply would not fit. The accumulated gases and the taut, hard flesh resisted all compression.
So they pushed harder. I mean, think of the intense force required to try and jam a pressurized, soft body into a stone container that's several sizes too small. The pressure, already immense from the decomposition gases, increased exponentially against the unforgiving stone.
And then, the ultimate indignity. Under that unforgiving pressure, William's abdomen ruptured. The chroniclers say it split open like an overripe fruit.
The sound must have been horrifying. A massive volume of putrefied matter, gases, fluids, semi-digested waste, just erupted outward in a foul, explosive shower.
The stench, already unbearable, became transcendent. A physical manifestation of rot and death washing over the immediate vicinity. The chroniclers used extreme language, suggesting the release was like the gates of hell had opened.
Chaos. Total, utter pandemonium. Nobles, bishops, all the gathered powerful people fled in absolute panic, scrambling over one another to escape the chamber. The funeral stopped dead.
Priests abandoned the altar mid-prayer. The ceremony was utterly ruined, desecrated by the king's own bursting corpse.
And the remaining staff, just aghast, were forced to hastily shove the twisted, undignified remains into the tomb and seal it immediately with mortar and heavy stone slabs to contain the horror permanently.
No final rites, no eulogies.
Just a frantic, unseemly end.
And the story spread like wildfire. Medieval society had a very clear framework for interpreting this disaster. It was viewed not as bad luck, but as divine intervention.
Absolutely. For a society so steeped in religious belief, this shameful, grotesque end was God's explicit verdict on William's life. Commentators seized on the harrying of the North and his unrelenting cruelty as the specific justification for God allowing such a degrading physical fate.
His end became the defining public moral lesson about the limits of human pride and the consequences of unrepentant violence.
And even after death, the indignities continued. William's tomb never became a site of reverence. The story of the bursting corpse was too well known. Centuries later, in 1562, Calvinist troops ransacked the abbey.
And they dug up his remains.
They did. They scattered them. Today, the monument at Saint-Étienne Abbey contains only a single saved thigh bone.
That's all that's left.
The man who conquered an entire nation and established a royal line has less than a full bone to mark his grave. A physical legacy as fragmented and empty as his final hours were horrifying.
So let's synthesize everything now. We have these incredible, vivid, historical accounts, and we can now use forensic and biological science to explain the exact mechanisms behind what the medieval chroniclers described.
We can confirm that the ultimate cause of death was overwhelming systemic infection sepsis stemming from an intestinal rupture. That led to septic shock and multi-organ failure. But the drama, the smells, the swelling, the rupture, that was all driven by specific biological agents.
Let's detail the chemistry of the stench, because that was the overwhelming factor that drove away the clergy. We're talking about putrescine and cadaverine. What exactly are these compounds?
Putrescine and cadaverine are diamonds. They are quite literally decomposition products, the signature calling cards of putrefaction. They're produced when anaerobic bacteria break down specific amino acids found in decaying proteins.
So they are the waste products of the bacteria consuming the king's tissue.
Exactly. And these molecules are incredibly volatile and potent, even in tiny amounts. They are designed by nature to signal decay. In William's case, the massive concentrated bacterial load within his body, accelerated by the heat, meant these compounds were being produced exponentially.
Creating that absolutely unbearable olfactory assault that paralyzed the funeral.
Precisely.
And let's return to the role of gas gangrene and the swelling. How did the Clostridium bacteria manage to create pressure strong enough to rupture a human abdomen against stone?
So, Clostridium bacteria are anaerobic, which means they thrive without oxygen. That's perfect for an internal infection where the blood supply has been compromised. They are voracious, and they generate hydrogen and carbon dioxide gases as they consume the sugars and proteins in muscle and fat tissue.
And because the body was in a sealed lead coffin.
There was no release valve. The pressure just built steadily, transforming the abdominal cavity into a contained vessel, far surpassing the tensile strength of the stretched, decaying skin.
So the pressure built up, relentlessly, just waiting for the weakest point to give way.
Yeah.
And that weakest point happened to be when immense physical force, the pallbearers pushing, was applied to the taut abdomen.
It was a perfect, terrible storm of physics and biology. The obesity made the fit impossible. The delayed burial allowed the gases to maximize, and the pressure created an inevitable explosion upon contact with the undersized stone sarcophagus.
What's fascinating here is how William's own physical vanity and consumption habits amplified the tragedy. King Philip's insult, ironically, foretold the physical destruction.
His girth was a biological amplifier. First, it made the initial injury more severe, and it provided more tissue for the infection to consume. Second, his lifelong indulgence meant the sarcophagus, based on his younger dimensions, was a guaranteed disaster waiting to happen.
His body composition, a symbol of his wealth, ensured his final humiliation.
It did.
And the staggering contrast, this horrifying 3-week-long death sentence that caused social and spiritual breakdown, is now, today, utterly survivable.
With relative ease. A diagnosis of intestinal rupture today would lead to immediate emergency surgery. Surgeons would repair the laceration, thoroughly irrigate the abdominal cavity to flush out all the spilled bacteria and detritus.
And then a targeted course of antibiotics.
A broad-spectrum antibiotic course to neutralize any remaining infection. He would be out of danger within days. Uncomfortable, yes, but alive.
But the technology wasn't the only thing missing in 1087. We have to consider the psychological dimension, the subjective experience of the conqueror.
For a man defined by physical control, by self-mastery and absolute command, the experience of having his own body turn into a foul, uncontrollable enemy must have been devastating beyond measure.
He had always been able to fight his way out of any situation. He could rally men, crush rebellion, demand peace.
But you can't negotiate with Clostridium.
Exactly.
He was fully aware that his own flesh was decomposing, that he was becoming repulsive to those around him, and that his hard-won power was dissolving before his very eyes. That sense of somatic betrayal, the realization that the body is the ultimate sovereign, is the deepest possible psychological terror for a conqueror.
His life was a study in imposing his will upon the external world.
And his death was a study in the impossibility of imposing will upon the internal microscopic world. His armor, his wealth, his armies. None of it could halt the silent, relentless logic of bacterial proliferation.
Is a powerful, resonant story because it reminds everyone, no matter how elevated their station, that they are ultimately subject to biological necessity. We began this dive with William the Conqueror, the legendary figure of Hastings and the Doomsday Book. We ended it with a bursting corpse, fled by his own nobles, whose power disintegrated faster than his flesh.
And the fact that this story, 900 years later, is still recounted with such detail proves its profound impact. William reshaped the map of Europe, yet his physical legacy is reduced to a single thigh bone. The man who conquered England was conquered by the one enemy no one, then or now, can entirely defeat: biology.
So if absolute earthly power cannot prevent this level of biological necessity and degradation, what does that teach us about the true, lasting value of human ambition? We've explored the intersection of his immense political control and his ultimate helplessness.
Think about that lesson. Even the greatest conquerors are just temporary vessels for microscopic life forms.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the darkest, most visceral corners of history and biology.
Until next time, keep digging.